Perfect. I'll get started. So first of all, thank you, Melly. Thank you for the invite. And I'm going to talk about a specific topic in content design, which I don't think gets addressed enough. So yeah, we'll begin about that. Just one second. But before that, I'll just talk a little bit about myself, like who am I? So I have overall 15 years of experience working in both agencies and unicorn product companies. And like most, I think designers, my journey has been very, very unique and very different. I was someone who's doing both content and design. I was basically someone, I was a designer in the sea of copywriters, and I was a copywriter in a sea of designers. And that kind of got me to think very interdisciplinary. And many times I noticed that while UX itself in the last decade became more popular, it became more mainstream, content was still not getting the same recognition. And many times it was something that was just done by designers. And what I ended up doing while working through many companies and leading the experiences of UX, I was setting up essentially content design processes. I'm pretty sure a lot of you guys will also be able to empathize, and you may be doing the same thing, that you may be the only content designer, or maybe small team in a larger design team itself. And in doing so, I was able to set up many processes. In fact, even see how content design as a field could grow. Which is where I was able to start even mentoring a lot of content designers, UX strategists, and all. And in my personal time, I also have my platforms where I create content on mythology, prehistory, space, and storytelling. So I see a lot of connections and overlaps between them. But content design became sort of a passion for me to be pursuing again and again. I have had the privilege of working with some interesting brands, and it was through working with these brands I realized how content is seen when you're doing. When I'm talking about content, I'm specifically talking about the UX content or content design itself. How it's actually managed, how it's thought through, how sometimes it's not given the importance. But interestingly, across different brands, I noticed how different brands, different people, different teams work with content differently, and this kind of gave me a more varied, like an experience overall. But essentially, what I realized, right, was that I used to be a blocker for my own team because I used to be the one advocating for content a lot. And in doing so, I sometimes realized that, like I became the bottleneck for my team when content had to be produced because I cared enough about the content. So, what I started doing was I started creating this concept of a playbook. And this idea that the team should have a playbook. Now, when I say playbook, I want to talk about that the idea of the playbook was less like the style guides we think of, or sort of just a manual that has to be handed down. So the way I see it is, it's less of a Ten Commandment, given to Moses by some sort of a divine figure, and it's more of a living, breathing artifacts, something like a coach and a player while the game is going. And this playbook, right, was something that I evolved in many companies with new frameworks, new ideas, and all coming in. And this ideas, processes, and all ultimately coalesced into certain specific systems and models that I realized was not something that just only helped my team and me during the projects, but in sharing with different design communities and content design, conferences and other places, I noticed that this was something that people were much more receptive to. So, I mean, I have many frameworks, that I have been doing, and each of them are a topic in their own right. But today we'll be specifically talking about a topic that is very crucial and something that is sometimes overlooked, which is on content debt. And I'll talk about a framework that I have built and how it can be used and applied. And a takeaway for you would be how to start seeing content debt in a new way and be able to track it. But before I go into content debt, right, let's get some definitions out of the way. I know as content designers, I'm pretty sure we care about what the word means. And I think let's do that here itself. I want to be clear about what I mean by the words that I'm using here. That is by no means to say that there are no other interpretations of it. It's just a way to set the context. So the first things, right? When I say the word content here, right, and I notice this even with my stakeholders and even designers and content designers, we all have a very different idea of what we mean by content. We know what content is, but it's important to like unpack it a little bit. So the way I see it is content is on the one spectrum and copy is the other spectrum. Content is the matter and copy is the packaging. It's the tangible wrapper that is given to the content itself, right? So this is the way I see the spectrum of content and copy. Now, content for me and the way I've defined it with my teams in many companies is this idea of it's basically intent plus information. The idea of the taking intent and like, ultimately adding information to it. And copy becomes information along with language and adding some bit of personality. What do we mean by these words? I'll just, yeah. So when you think of intent, think of like goals, purposes, anything that you want to, understand the question of like, finally asking the question why, right? And when we think of information, right, there are two parts of information. One is information in terms of data points, facts, figures, anything that actually stores in, a data itself, right? Whether it's, a payment application. So if you're doing a transition, the exact amount, how, what, who to, to whom is the payment happening, those are data points, right? So it's important to look at the data points itself. And the other thing is the nomenclatures, phrasing, how we think about it, especially in languages. This is where it becomes very important to understand how we are, writing or how we are capturing a particular concept, right? And this information, becomes the what. This is what we are trying to convey itself. Um, and the language then becomes the part where we are bringing in grammar, we're bringing syntax and all. This is the part where we start looking at how to communicate this. And that's why, this and along with the personality where we start looking at, voice and tone and all, it's actually, again, the how. And we have tendency as designers, content designers, especially to prove our value that we tend to focus a lot and there's a lot of over indexing and conversations on the language and personality front, but not enough on the intent and information, because the entire spectrum is what creates content. And many times when we are advocating for content, we have to fight not just for the language and personality, but also for the intent and information itself. We do that, but I just meant that we have to bring this up in a very modular fashion to be able to make sure that, to ensure that all these things are being surfaced up when we are talking about content. So yeah, now that we covered the definitions, we should talk about what exactly is content debt, right? And I'll talk about how my content designers and I in many teams were able to expose and encounter it as a practice because it became something very, very important. Simply put, when we say content debt, we talked about content. The debt becomes the hidden cost when we don't deliberate on content, when we do something very fast, when we're shipping it out. It could be uncharacteristic tone, it could be a wrong language, it could be a grammatical mistake that has not been corrected. Remember, all these things have a cost that someone has to pay at some point of time. But at a systemic level, right, it has an after effect where we end up prioritizing the wrong thing, and that ends up hurting or costing someone in the pipeline, whether it's the content designers themselves, whether it's designers, developers, the company, or it could even be the end users who may not understand the certain information because of content debt, right? It is fair to say that it deteriorates the product, but it also puts an unnecessary pressure to all stakeholders, which is why it's important to not just acknowledge content debt, but to address it as soon as possible. Now, the problem with just the idea of a content debt, and I know we all have heard that term, right, is that we used to talk about, okay, there is a content debt that has to be solved, but there was no right way of measuring it. And what I noticed was that the problem was not that the content debt exists. It actually hardens over time, right? It's almost, the analogy I would say is it's almost like cement, right? Ultimately, when you have like concrete and this thing freshly painted and someone steps in, it'll actually start start drying up and start hardening over time, and that itself has its own consequences. And also the problem is it leaves its mark. So like cement, if someone walks on wet cement and leaves it, that thing is going to make a particular mark, right? So I personally felt that the metaphor of cement or cementing was important, because as we leave the content debt, it starts cementing and it becomes harder, and it ends up leaving a mark that becomes harder to remove over time. So in the framework, I realized that we needed to find a way to acknowledge this content debt, and we needed to actually be able to index it by the severity of the debt that happens at different levels, right? I mean, you must have heard these kind of statements that that comes, right, and this is how the debt gets cemented. So it could be like a designer or a product manager saying something like, "Ki, listen, can we just fit the copy without breaking the lines? Can you just help with the copy?" And this is where you turn into a wordsmith, and you're trying to fit the copy based on the space that has been given, right? It could also be that, okay, listen, the dev cannot make some changes at this point in time, so changing a layout would be a problem. Can we just add those, can we add those lines, or this adding those lines, even if it helps, is a problem because it's already in dev. We may have to relocate it later, right? So not only it's a content debt, it also becomes a tech debt, right? And many times, because no one is looking at it, I'm pretty sure as content designers you must have faced it, is that the terms being used across a product are very different, and sometimes the question comes, what should we go with, right? I mean, if you're using a specific term, very interestingly, in my previous organization, when I was working in a construction tech company, we had a sales navigator. So the one of the problems was that when we are looking at prospect buyers, should we call them prospects or lead? And it was a funny thing because across the app, the different places had different names. When I had joined the company, this actually had become one of the problems to solve. To see what is the right term, and what should be the way to solve this problem, because the product was already out in the market. Plus, there was already a lot of tech debt. So these terminologies itself become a problem in across the content design experience itself. So essentially, when we look at the different stages of design, right, there are different stages, and I'll go in detail. The point is that as we move through the stages of design, the content debt, if left unchecked, builds up and hardens over the product stages. So these stages are what ultimately are the places where the content debt should be addressed. But if it's not, it becomes harder for the next stage to address them. So let's go with one by one to the different stages at this thing. And this is the core model. We'll talk about another updation to this model. But essentially, while there are multiple ways of looking at UX processes, most of the design, or most of the UX works with sort of a PRD, right? Maybe a product person, or the team together with design, content, research, and the product people have thought through. They have to think of the feature, and they have to write down the feature, which could be at a product level, it could be at a visioning level, it could be during a workshop level. So the severity of the first debt comes if the content is being addressed after the vision has been decided. So if you're not looking at content while the vision is happening, like what exactly should be the information, what should be the language, what should be the tone and voice, especially for a new product. For an old product, it would be like, okay, when we are building a new feature, what should be considered from a communication point of view? What should be the information we should consider? What should be the language we should consider? If we already have a language, what can and cannot we can do? And at the same time, in terms of personality, what are we bringing through these features? How does our brand or our design and all will evolve and be interacted with? So at this point of time, right, you have a high degree of freedom. So for the content folks, when I say for content, I'm talking about the content folks. They have a high degree of freedom to shape the product experience, to look at the user intent. And this is the place where there will be minor constraints to bring the content designs true impact. Even if the content changes over time, the establishing content deliberation at this point of time is the best time itself. So this is a place where it's yet to be cemented. That's why I call it level 0. It's the setting stage, right? Going further, the first stage that comes in this is the L1. So after L0, we have L1, where we have the structure stage. This is where on an ideal process, your designers are creating the wireframe, but the severity comes if if the content is being checked after the wireframes have been drawn, where the logical gaps in the communication are already embedded in the flow. So the reason I would say this is a debt is that even if the designers or you've thought through the flow without thinking through content, there's a likelihood that you will face a little bit of a resistance by someone who's already drawn the flows itself, and then you're trying to fix the content. It's more important to think through the content itself and then make the flows. So what happens here is that if you try to address some content, this thing, you may be able to. There will be some constraints. It could be that, okay, fine, we have to have the flow in a certain way. We can't have more number of clicks and this thing. And again, you're going to get into a place where you will have some things to discuss and all, right? But yet, this is the place where it starts cementing. You can address the content debt right here itself, right? You can think through the information, language, and personality much earlier on. At least if you can think through the information itself, this is the safest amount of debt that you can actually have. That will actually be not a problem to address. Moving on, the level two, that this is where, imagine if the designers have worked on the design and now they're asking to check if the content works or not, right? This is a debt that comes when you're working on content after the design has been more or less created. The reason this becomes a difficult thing, and this is also a sort of an anecdotal evidence that I've had in my this thing, is that despite the fact that I've had I was a designer and a content designer, and I had led teams that were design and content teams. I would notice many times that the design team that I would lead would be less receptive to making content changes on a design they made. Sometimes it could be a personal thing, but many times it was also because they would get a little married to the particular flow, and they would end up trying to justify why a particular content, if it changes the design, won't work. And it's a human thing, right? There is a sense of like a sort of a sunk cost fallacy, right? Like you won't want to make too many changes to something that you've invested time in, right? Obviously, as UXers, most of them would appreciate improving the process, and iteratively they would work with the content itself. But to be really honest, you would already start seeing a little bit of a resistance here, right? And many times this is a place where, like, if a content designer is not able to make a case for why a content needs to change the design, many times that won't, the content would have to serve the design rather than the design serving the content. And this is the place where you have a high risk of cementing already happening, right? So there are considerable constraints. This is also a time where, like, many times, realistically speaking, when the designer has made the design, they're already in a process of wanting to hand over, and changing the design based on content now coming in affects the timeline, and no one wants to be the cause of delaying the timelines, right, itself, right? So this is where you start seeing considerable constraints itself. And then we go into the solutioning stage, which is where, when you are addressing content debt after a build has been coded, this is where you have the developers working on the development itself. They may be working, or they may already have been shipping. They may already be putting up some sort of a production, in space for to interact and all. And the problem is that many times, because development is there, the question becomes that, okay, fine, how do we fit the messaging without breaking the feature or changing too much in the design itself, right? And again, there's minimal amount of freedom itself. This becomes a bigger problem because many times the changes and all come, and during a QA round, and the question becomes that how can we make the minimum amount of change without having to do too much, right? And I'm pretty sure all you content designers also may have had this kind of an issue where you could not, you are noticing that there's a resistance in making the changes because the product is already in development, and the design at this the design itself having a rehaul would affect the timelines, and the same thing goes for content, right? So you can imagine this is a place where your content debt has been considerably cemented. And then you come to the shipping stage. This is where the product is now being released. This is the time where the company is waiting with bated breath, having, trying to have a sort of a GTM, go to market launches, and we're trying to get the product out. Obviously, we want to make sure that the product is good and all, and many times smaller iterations would happen. But if you notice some sort of a bigger issue in content, right, this is not the time where you will have a lot of say in changing the content unless you are deeply embedded in the team, or you have like, maybe folks or, content design leaders who are able to completely, like take, help you take a U-turn. But from a practical, this thing, there's, little freedom here, right? And even if you are able to make some changes, there's going to be massive systemic constraints. You would have to, there will be a lot of, to win a certain battle, you may have to lose certain other things, and you have to decide on which hill you want to die upon at this stage, right? What is it that you want to focus on? Maybe the biggest issue that I've noticed that the content designers focus on is grammatical issues. This is not the time where they will be looking at personality or changing the content. This thing, they're just like, okay, can we make sure that the content is sounding right, right? And then comes the societal stage, and this is actually the stage where this is the level 5, and this is the last stage in some ways, because not only has the content been shipped, but the users have adapted and interacted with the product, and the product has normalized the unclear communication. So many times when you notice, or when we go through social media and we notice people criticizing or having a problem with a certain app, right? We all love to trash on a certain maybe productivity tool or this thing, because it's the UX is very, very frustrating. Maybe the communication, maybe it could be a banking app, right? I mean, we all find some sort of frustrations when we are working with legacy applications and all, right? But it's almost like people are used to it and they think that there's nothing better right now. And this is the place where if you're trying to make changes once the product is already out in the market, and you're trying to convince your your company that, okay, fine, we need to do a complete rehaul, we need to change it, you won't have any sort of a realistic degree of freedom in content. I mean, even if you're able to do it, you may be able to align the language and rework it. It'll come through an insurmountable cultural constraints. Cultural in the sense that it could be stakeholders. It could be that you have to not just convince your colleagues, but you have to convince your boss's boss itself. Especially, you may have to convince senior stakeholders, and that becomes its own challenge, because you may only have a certain political will in this point of time. Second of all, if you're new in the company, or you're someone who's if you're also like maybe you're junior in the company, you may not have the political clout to make that sort of a rework happening. Yes, you can make a case for it, but there's going to be a good chance that you may not be able to do it. And this is where like content designers start getting frustrated, because you will notice that there is certain content stuff that has come in. Maybe it could be that the communication on the CTAs are all different, right? Maybe in one in a form you had next, in other ones you had proceed, and maybe you want to change it, but at this point in time you have to convince you have to befriend the developer, you have to convince your own team that, okay, let's clean it up and let's have a standardized flow itself, right? Conversely, you may have a product that is very mature, that is happy to do it, and maybe the problem here would be nuanced itself. Maybe the problem is at a localization level, right? But you do have certain content debt, right? And there you go. This is a sort of the levels of content data at a core model level where you have it. The color coding is also done in a way to think of it as a clay that is getting more and more dried up, and it becomes more and more, hardened by the end of it. Uh, and the thing with this leveling, right, is that while when you are able to think like this, you're able to understand that what level we are at. So many times when I used to work with my with my content designers, and I would work with a new team, I would first of all acknowledge that what level of debt are we already at with that product, with that feature, maybe with the culture of the company itself, because it automatically told us what we cannot do. And this is also helps us, because it helped me pivot from, okay, instead of trying to fix everything, let's do the quick fixes to buy trust before going ahead. So example, what I was able to do was this idea that like I noticed that in the company many times the design practice was a content afterthought design. That even if there was amazing UX team, and maybe the design was valued by the company, the content was something that was poured in at the end, or just while the design is happening, with like maybe the ratio of the designers and the content designers was completely skewed. So what I ended up doing by creating a framework like this was I was able to show the stakeholders that we were already on a high level, and that was impacting the content designers or content design teams impact itself, right? I would literally talk to them that these are the places where our content debt is showing it's already high, right? And over time, you are able to show a certain bit of pattern. um, the idea was that while I could show them this, I was also able to show them that if we can, for the next launch or for the next cycle, if we can address the content debt at a lower level, maybe at a level 2 and level 3, we will start becoming more content aligned instead of a content afterthought. And ideally, we should be moving towards what I call a content informed design. So this content informed design is a process to get to the content first approach, right? And that is what something that I was trying to champion. And luckily, with many successes and many failures, there were places that we were able to make impactful changes. We were able to convince a lot of teams why this would be valuable, because addressing content debt early on, right? And it's also a sort of a rapport that you built with your own teams, because the product, the design, maybe the development team noticed the problem, that okay, what content debt is and how it's getting cemented and why it's becoming a problem. Maybe this was something that they will start valuing. I had many incidents where if the design or the development team required content to be done quickly, they couldn't afford us the time that the content design team was asking. But the next cycle, by showing this cementing debt, we were able to tell them that, look, if we can have more time, or if we can do a content research at this point of time, or we can fix the content right now and take a little bit of extra time, it'll save you during the shipment time. We won't have to make changes. The content will be more impactful. So many times, many stakeholders would see that value and they would say, okay, let's do it. Let's do it right this time rather than trying to fix it, right? Many of them still didn't see the value, until it was too late. And that's very important. The idea is to just show the debt that is happening before you fix it, right? It's about tracking the debt. But I'm pretty sure all of you must be thinking, and this question must be coming, the elephant in the room, or right now, I should say elephant in the internet, is what about AI? Right now, the process, the design and content design specifically has been affected by AI, right? And AI right now has become something that everyone is talking about. There is no denying, and it's an understatement to say that the design process itself is changing by AI, right? Um, if you just think, yeah, if you notice, there are multiple tools that have been coming, this thing, and I'm pretty sure some of you may have had the opportunity of working and playing with these tools. Especially as a content designer, it's very important for us to, to not just play with this tool, but to leverage them in our practice itself. But there are a lot of tools that are also trying to build the product directly. I think especially with certain products, there's this idea, and the current zeitgeist is the idea of creating apps within a few minutes. The concept of vibe coding has become sort of mainstream, right? And it's important to understand that AI has a lot of advantage, but when it comes to the content, right, it is actually silently creating debt before we even notice it. So unlike the previous time where we would actually notice that we were not able to do it, AI is actually creating a debt before we even understand it's a debt, right? We actually only see the impact of the debt. And this has led to a new problem that has emerged. And this new problem, right, requires us to rethink that the old model. The old model still works. I have been using the old model more or less, but with the AI, I noticed that we need to also understand, and the idea is that that content debt is not going away, it's actually getting hidden more and more, right? Which meant that we needed to just update the particular model we were talking about, especially because now the workflows involve making uh, prompts to direct prototypes, right? And it it kind of replaces this idea of intentional mapping, like the concept of wireframing and making complete design Figma prototypes and all. Even that may even go away in some point of time. I mean, the future is up for grabs, right? But the idea is that people are embracing AI products or AI powered, design processes and creating products through AI. So as content designer, it's important to understand and acknowledge how that can happen. So before we talk about the content that itself, how it happens, I realized that what is actually happening with AI is that it's not just affecting the process of creating content, it is also having an effect on our memory. And what there's a medical term called atrophy, which is basically the idea that your muscles are getting weakened. This especially happens when you're not exercising, or you have certain conditions which are not letting you live the most healthiest life. So this idea of atrophy, right, is actually something that the AI is affecting, not our physical muscles, but our mental and judgmental muscles. Because the act of making decisions, the act of checking, the idea of deliberation is something that we are passing on to AI, which is why I realized that what the debt is actually becoming is what I call an AI atrophied debt. And this is something you need to acknowledge, because it's not just affecting the content creation itself, which is creating the atrophication here, but it's also going to affect the way we think about the particular product. We'll come back to that, but just to move ahead. So apart from the core model, right, the current model acknowledging the AI also has 5 steps. And if the previous ones had gone through the different stages, what I call the 5 S's, sorry, the 6 S's. This one, we will talk about the 6 P's stages, right? Because what's happening here is that when we look at an AI process, or the AI process of making design, the content debt is actually getting cemented faster. It's more invisible, actually. So let's go through it, quickly. So at a first level, right, the debt, the zero level, you have the premise stage. This is where you are training the AI. So if your content, or you're checking, or you're deliberating on content after the AI has already been trained, maybe wrong assumptions have got through, wrong data sets have got through, and this is a place where you can still, try to ensure that the training becomes better, and you still have a higher degree of changes, especially if you align the AI training data with content intent and all. Especially like if you are working on a product which has AI, what does it get trained on? Think of it as maybe an example would be if you're making a health application that is meant for generic this thing, and you find out that the data it's been trained on has only been upper middle class people, and it has not been trained on blue collar workers and all. So automatically, or maybe there's a sort of a race component, that it's been trained on a certain maybe certain skin color, but not on the other. Or maybe there's a gender component, that there's a bias in the data itself, right? And that affects the output it gives, which is where it's important at this stage to train the data on the right content, to think through intent, to create guardrails itself. And content designers are definitely the best people to be involved in this stage itself, right? Then we have the L1 stage, which is basically the prompt stage. Simply put, this is the place where you're giving vague instructions, whether you are yourself giving vague instructions for creation of the design or the prototype itself, and you're missing the blind spots. You are not thinking through the exact, not just the intent, but you're not giving the right information itself, right? So this is a place where you will have more, some constraints coming in if like the prompts itself are not good, and the prompt library that you have in the particular company are not doing justice itself, right? So this is a good place for design, content designers to get involved, and to make sure that the the prompts created itself are acknowledging it, especially if you have a team that are trying to generate or create direct prototypes through this thing. Get involved during the prompt discussion itself. What prompts should we have? Does this also cover the content aspects itself or not, right? And now with products like Lovable and all, collaboration has become much more easier. So this is a good place to actually get involved. Then we have the polish stage. This is where, like, you have an output and you're trying to just refine the things. Maybe you're trying to say the button has to shift a little bit and all. But the problem with this is that, when you have these polished outputs, it kind of conceals meaninglessness. Like that, you must have seen a lot of videos and all, which talk about, oh, we've created the website or the app in like a few minutes. It looks pretty good, but the problem is that when you actually read through it, you realize that the product is not meaningful. It's just a mimicry of like the aggregate of what it had been trained on, right? So this is again a place where content becomes the a natural instinct would be to fix content after the design has been done. But this is also a place to notice that you're already at a debt level 2 if you're fixing content after the design has been created, right? And you will have certain limitations. Maybe you will have to work through the design and make the changes itself, right? um, And that goes through the idea of production. So if you've created through vibe coding, you've created the front end and all, and now you're creating the back end, but the phrasing itself has flawed logic, and the logic has already been embedded. No amount of content and no training is going to make trying to bring the intent and the information back again. And there again, you will have minimal freedom itself, right? So now you have overwhelming constraints in terms of your impact itself. And when they get shipped, the same problem happens, because many times right now the AI powered products are using AI to do that. Right now the pretext of using them is this idea of prioritizing speed over relevancy, right? The idea that you can create a product, ship it out, get feedback itself. But what we are not realizing is that this is the place where your content debt is already very high. So if you've created a product within a few hours and now you're shipping it within the next week, you've already reached content level 4. So as a content designer, you've already created like constraints for yourself before you can do that. And this is something that we can point out to the designers and the team that is working on that particular product itself, right? The last stage goes into the perpetuating stage, which is basically that now the AI is resurfacing, because AI has been trained, it's already out in the public. It's resurfacing suboptimal service. Maybe the output of it's giving is suboptimal because the product is being trained on these things. And the problem here is that the product is now perceived as unreliable. People just assume that, okay, this is what it is. I mean, you notice this is a thing that with OpenAI and all the products, right? Like there's a warning that AI may hallucinate because this happens. We don't know why, right? And there's already a debt created that it may happen, so enter at your own risk, kind of a thing. So as a content designer, you don't have any realistic degree of freedom here. And if you're trying to change it, trying to change the core product again, you will have insurmountable cultural constraints again and again, right? So this becomes your, what I call the AI atrophied content, content debt cementing levels itself, right? Depending on your company, you can obviously apply both the things, and you can acknowledge which debt you are at, and how would you want to start addressing it. Just the simple acknowledgement of knowing where you are at automatically should give you a sense of what are the problems and what are the things that you will have to do. Because simply put, right, I would also tell you that it's not just the content designers who will suffer. It's going to affect everyone's way of thinking, especially the AI powered products and the AI itself, right? Because when speed is weakening clarity, what's also getting eroded is awareness, through automation. So if you think of the 6 steps, right, the it's very important to also understand that this is not something that has just been a anecdotal feeling. There are papers, there are articles being written on this thing. In fact, today itself an article came out about chat gpt is now getting it's polluting the internet. Overall quality is bad because AI, internet is consuming its own AI generated content, and there's a whole concept of AI model collapse where it's working on the data that is already AI generated itself, and that's creating a lot of problems. There's also new studies that have come out recently, which is talking about how it's affecting human cognition. There have been control room studies where they notice that people who are using AI are using less of their cognitive muscles compared to the things, and it is affecting the way we think, the way we behave itself, right? Essentially it's creating a sort of a dual debt drift. The reason I call it a dual debt is because not only it's having an effect on the content debt, but it's also having a debt on, it's also having a cognitive debt itself. It's the atrophy of the critical judgment. How do you think through the problem, right? What would you want? How would you want to go about it? Do you want to consume what you want to consume, or is the AI algorithm recommending you what you need to consume, right? And there's a fading of the content reasoning muscles across the team itself. So when you are vibe coding, when you're trying to create products very quickly, you're also losing the critical thinking, the very essence of UX and content design itself, right? This is not to say that the AI is not helpful. It's just to understand that AI is very good at hiding the debt, and that means that there has to be more sort of a focus on how to bring out the debt, how to mark the debt, and how to address the debt. Essentially speaking, right, there are three zones that you can look at across the six thing. So there is what I call the first two levels, the first two layers is what I call the zone of cracks. This is where the fissure is shown. So if you are at this space, this is still a good place to be because the debt has not solidified and slight misalignments are there, but it can influence the thing. So this is a good place for you to try to get at, right? This is the place where you will notice the cracks itself and you can try to solve through content design. Then you have the zone of contention. This is where conflicts and negotiations will start happening. So if you're at this stage already, if you're working on a product that is already at this stage and you as a content designer helping, assume there's going to be conflict, assume that there is there is going to be a lot of resistance itself. Even if the debt is minor, it's going to have a bigger impact, but fixing it now, it will have its own tension. You will affect the timelines, but it's going to be more important because the next zone is the zone of crisis. This is where the problem of content debt is no longer just a question of small issues and all. It becomes a reputational problem of the product. It could be if you're working on like mission critical products like medical or any sort of security and all, your content that can cost someone's life or money or their I mean their well-being itself, right? So this is where it has it. But essentially the debt starts affecting the public perception. People just assume that okay, this is how the product is, this is not going to be, the trust is already eroded by this end. So these are the different zones that you can think about. Even if you don't think through all the layers, you have to think through what zone you are at and how do you start tackling the debt at this level itself, right? It's important to understand that the severity of a debt is not equal on the different components of the content and this thing. So as we talked about content to copy, the way to think about it is like if there's debt at language and a personality level, it's very manageable. You can maybe make a small update. It's like making a grammatical mistake or realizing that the word is not working and making a change. And many times as designers and content designers, we tend to focus on this because it's manageable, right? We tend to think that, okay, let's make sure that let's make the changes in the language itself. But if you notice that there are debts at the information level, this is not ideal. You should make sure that the right information, right words, right terminologies, right data itself is being used itself, right? And the biggest problem is when you are actually having intent level issues, that you're not clear about what is this the content supposed to do, and that debt is much worse, which is where it's important to this thing. I'm sorry, there must be a I think this information is randomly being pasted, but the essential point is that all the debts are not the same. Here's an example. I will talk about how I ended up documenting it, because it's great to have these debts, right? But the way to document it is, simplest this thing. It could be on your Figma file, it could be this thing. But what essentially I'm trying to say is that you should mark the debt. You should try to, if you notice a debt, mark it and try to surface it. So this was a product we were making, a payment application for one of the biggest banks in India, and my content, design team noticed an issue when the designer had made this, where they made a transition, and what happened was as soon as you fill the information, a sort of a red text comes which says that you will be charged additional thing. So my content designer this thing made this sort of a write up, essentially talking about that this is a dark pattern. But I'll show you the specific part which we this thing. So we actually started calling it out in our comments and this thing, where we said that, hey, this falls under debt cementing level 2. We need to address this. Now, even if it didn't get addressed at that point in time, because we marked it all over Figma, in our comments, in our Jira tickets, in maybe in Linear, wherever you have your tickets and documentations, we were able to surface that how much content that is there. And we noticed that a lot of content that was happening at a level 2 itself. So luckily, we just had to work with the design team to ensure to make it at level 1. If it was happening at level 5, we would have had to work with developers much quickly on, right? So this also gave us a sort of a trend of where we are seeing the debt. And later on, when we talked to the teams to talk about how designers can do better impact during the performance review, to even like when I had to build capacity to a team, I was able to convince them that, hey, the content design team is not able to have a full impact because of the way the debts are coming in. The content design team is bought in too late. Now, obviously, you can, content design team can try to have a seat at the table. But the problem was realizing when and how content needs to be part and parcel of throughout the things, rather than thinking of copy as a something to just be added during the process. was something I was trying to show, that why content debt cementing is very, very important. It helps all of us acknowledge something that is happening that creates a bigger problem itself. So yeah, just two takeaways, and I'll wrap it up. One is that content debt, right, is not the thing. Content debt is not simply just about like the hidden cost and all. It's also showing a root cause. The root cause of a content debt is absence of governance. This is something that this thing Maridel Walkington, she's a content strategist in this thing, Mozilla. She had said this. She had written a very nice article on content debt itself. So the idea is that when you don't have content standards, and content standards are not just best practices, but how to create content throughout the process itself, right? Which again goes back to why I started creating content, playbooks, because I noticed this was not something that was getting addressed. Secondly, it's important to understand how AI is now going to affect it, right? So AI is not just going to, be about AI. It's not going to just speed up how we ship content. It's also going to end up, making us skip critical thinking. And every time we do that, we are, catching debt, which is getting cemented. So my request to you would be that if you're working with AI or not AI, count your debt, acknowledge it, at least, make sure your team acknowledges it, mark the level. This thing, the framework is one way to do it. You are we are welcome to improve and rework that, but just acknowledging and marking the cementing level is a very good way of at least being able to address and to bring it up. The philosophy is basically the name it to tame it. Because we don't talk about it, we didn't even talk about how debt happens, what is debt and how debt happens. Just this idea of bringing content debt, at least for me in my practice, has helped solve a lot of problems that were very critical, that no one else cared about. But me, as a content designer and a design leader, I literally was the one advocating for it. Many times I felt very lonely in this battle, but I noticed that when I started getting more and more people see the value of it, I started getting more and more support, not just from content designers, but from designers and PMs and other leaders who started seeing that value in these kind of frameworks, which help you surface these problems itself. So yeah, that was the content debt thing. This is obviously one part of the playbook. I also have other parts which are related. There is a content rule. How do you make decisions? How do you track the importance of a decision? And there's also this idea of a content guardian and explorer, which is a framework which talks about who makes the content decisions. Like how do we make content decision? Who challenges content decisions, right? So these are some of the things, and obviously I have more frameworks itself. I'm going to be putting out more content, and hopefully we can maybe I'll we can come back for another talk for another topic itself. But I hope this helped you, and yeah, I hope this was something that was useful to you. I'm happy to take in any questions. um, yeah, and this is my email ID and my number, and you can follow me on LinkedIn.